moving on, we're sort of continuing our tour of how to dry out applications, and a really neat feature that they really got right in Active Record sometime late in Rails 2 is the idea of having reusable scopes. So one way to motivate why you'd care about scopes is suppose we wanted to think about customizing associations, right? We already have an association between movies and reviews, but there are certain common cases that we'd like to capture as sort of reusable queries. So for example, a movie might be appropriate for kids. Well, you could just tell that from the movie's rating, whether it's PG or PG-13. But movies that have at least some number of reviews, or at least have some average score across all their reviews, and then what if you wanted to combine those things, right? Because movies with at least n reviews, well, clearly that requires some sort of a join. You have to look both at movies and reviews to figure that out. Whereas things like movies appropriate for kids, all you got to do is look at the movies themselves. So is there a way that you can sort of express some of these reusable queries in a way that you can actually put them together like building blocks? And in fact, scopes allow you to do exactly this. So we can, for example, let's if we defined, this is the code we would like to we'd like to be able to write is movies or movie.forKids would return just movies with a certain rating, but we'd like to be able to chain onto that, for example, movie with good reviews, maybe above average review rating of 3 across all the reviews for that movie. Or maybe we could define something like a movie with many fans, meaning a certain minimum number of moviegoers have written reviews for it, and we could define recently reviewed as the last review for this movie was posted within some date. So the idea is that the reviews can have things that are time varying. In other words, the idea of recently reviewed obviously depends on when you evaluate it, right? It's something that has to be evaluated at runtime, but you'd still like to capture the reusability of these queries in a nice declarative way. So let's take a look at some code that allows us to do just this. OK, so here's an example of how we could do something like what I just said. So I've added 2 things to the movie model here. I've added 2 scopes. One scope is called for kids. And by the way, you should already sort of, the metaprogramming bells should be going off in your head, right? Because I'm passing a symbol, and the symbol is going to become basically the name of a class method. So one kind of scope is where I'm just declaring conditions of the same kind that I would pass to where. You can think of it as I'm almost capturing the desired behavior of a where clause, but I'm using a shorthand so that I don't have to do it over and over again. But the more interesting one is something like this. Here's another kind of scope where what I'm providing is basically a function, in this case a function of 1 argument, so I can pass a cutoff score for the average review. And what's going to happen in this lambda expression is that I'm joining the movie table with the reviews table. I'm grouping that by the movie ID, and then I'm taking the average of all of the reviews relative to this argument value. Right? So first of all, why is this in a lambda expression? It's because I need to be able to evaluate this for a particular argument value. Right? I need to be able to instantiate at runtime a version of this procedure that will have sort of embedded into it the right value for the cutoff, so that I can do things like with good reviews parentheses 3 and have the right query synthesized. So these are 2 different ways that I can set up reusable scopes. And what's interesting is that these are stackable. So in this terminal window, which I'm hoping is big enough text for you to see, except the terminal window is getting unmanageably large there. So I just cut and pasted that code into my terminal window, which means that, what did I call it for kids? So that's a legal query, and it actually returns the right legal thing. Now, I haven't populated my database here with any reviews, but it's still legal. Okay, what will happen if I hit return right now? Why am I going to get an error? Anybody? Why am I about to get an error? I haven't passed it an argument, right? The way that I define the scope with good reviews is that I define it as a lambda expression that expects 1 argument. So sure enough, wrong number of arguments in my block. No problem, I can fix that. Now what did I get back? Well, I got back the empty collection, which is not surprising because I don't have any reviews. But what I was trying to illustrate is that I can stack these 2 things. In fact, I can stack them in the other order too. Now, I'll still get a blank because I haven't populated with any reviews. But what's interesting is to ask the question, where did the query occur? Right? So I see a query going to the database here. You'd think that that means that the query is happening at the moment that I type the command line. But suppose I do this. What just didn't happen? I didn't do a query, right? If we assume, as is indeed the case, that when we see this printed out in Rails console, it means that the query actually went to the database. This time, no query went to the database. So what's the difference? What did I do the second time different from what I did the first time? Ready for a clue? In case you missed it. What's going on? Is it lazy or is it not lazy? Lazy or eager? Does anyone want to take a guess? An informed guess?
The movie gets returned when you're just running that one statement when you assign it. So when it returns the movie, it then evaluates the query. Whereas if on the example where it doesn't run, you're actually just returning nil. So you don't actually evaluate the end.
So it's tricky, but what's happening, you're on the right track here, right? When I do this example, what does the command line interpreter for Ruby do every time I type in an expression? It prints the value of the expression, right? So remember we said that queries are lazy. The query doesn't actually happen until somebody tries to consume the value, but the interpreter is going to consume the value because it has to print something out. But when I do this, M gets assigned, and the only thing the interpreter needs to print out is the value of the last expression evaluated, which is nil. So no query actually happens in that case, right? Now, did I do this just to sort of show off some Ruby trickery? No, there's a really good reason for doing it this way, right? Coming back to the idea that we're using these higher order functions that we define, and we don't actually, we can compose these things together in ways that allow us to do the query in the future, but doesn't happen right away. I'm giving you a preview as to why you're going to care about this. One thing we're going to talk about when we get to operations and scalability and performance is that a surefire way to have a bad day at the office is to have your app bottleneck because your database is getting overloaded. Right? We've already talked about you can't sort of horizontally scale your way out of the database problem like you can with the logic tier, with the presentation tier. So wouldn't it be nice if there was a way for you to write code such that in your controller method, you have things in your controller method that look like they're queries, and in your view, you have stuff that looks like it's just printing out the results of the queries. Well, now we know, because we've gone through this little example, that the thing in the controller method that looks like it does a query doesn't really necessarily do it. It just sets up an object that could do it, and then in the view, when you actually try to render that value of that object, that's when the query happens. So as a preview, where we're going with this is in the view, suppose you could say, around portions of your view, basically check my cache, and if I've already done this query recently, I don't need to do it again. So it's very powerfully, you can have logic in your controller that looks like it's where the query is happening, but because the query is actually deferred until the view, in the view you can actually put logic that says, conditionally just render the same view we did last time because we don't have to recompute this. It hasn't changed in the database. So as a preview, it gives you, among other things, a really nice way to do caching. But the real value in this example is that it allows these things to be stacked. Right? And the reason that they're stackable is you can stack as many as you want because no query actually ever happens until somebody tries to consume the first value. That's when the query hits the database. As another preview, one of the design patterns that we're going to look at when we start talking about design patterns in a couple of weeks is their design pattern called the decorator, which means I have a function that does something, but I want to enhance it so that it also does something else. So the way it applies in this example is I have a method that returns movies for kids, but I want to decorate it so that it also is able to filter out only the ones with good reviews. Or it also filters out only the ones that have been reviewed recently. So it still does everything it used to do, but I also want to add a new thing that it does. And I want to do that without modifying the existing code that I have. That's called decorating the existing code, and it's an example of the decorator design pattern. This is a really nice example of the decorator design pattern. We can create a bunch of different scopes and stack them together like building blocks, adding on to existing behaviors, and not having to pay the price, as it were, until the view tries to consume the values. So based on that, we should be easily able to answer this question, which is looking at this small snippet of code where we've got some controller logic up here and some stuff in a view down here. Where do database queries happen? Do they happen only in line 3, only in line 6 and 7, in both line 3 and line 6 and 7, or does it depend on the return value of the first scope because we don't know what the second scope is going to have to operate on?